So we'll be talking about stereotyping today. You might have heard about the word stereotyping in the media quite often. Stereotypes are generalizations about certain groups. So we might regard as, for example, the Chinese people having similar characteristics. So when we talk of Chinese, we think of them as having certain characteristics. Or at least the media simplifies them as having these similar characteristics. But we do not understand that there could be variations among those social groups. Stereotyping kind of disregards these variations. And an important thing to remember here is that these stereotypes are not based on our first-hand experiences. This is something that we learn from the mass media, and that is why the role of the mass media becomes very important here. So we need to know a lot more about stereotypes, what these stereotypes are, and we will also see that in our daily lives when we interact with people, do we regard people who belong to a different group or people who belong to an out group, do we regard them as having very similar characteristics? So before I go ahead, let's see this very popular video from this English series Mind Your Language. And here people of different nationalities, Italians, Spanish, Russian, Indian, Pakistani, how they are stereotyped as having similar characteristics, or when they speak one kind of a language or a diction or those kind of things. So let's enjoy this video.
Oh, well, try again, Max. Please give me a word beginning with the letter A. And I don't want A something, just one word beginning with the letter A. Think of a fruit. Apple? Apple. Good. Danielle. B.
B for brown.
Good.
B for beautiful.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. Hannah. C.
Red.
Red. What's that got to do with C?
Red C.
I want a word beginning with the letter C.
Cow.
Yes, well done. Tarot. D.
Arthur. Darko.
Darko. Well, dark.
Dark.
Yes, good.
So I'm sure you like that video. Now let's go into a bit of history. The word stereotype originally came from the printing industry. We were looking at these printing presses, and those printing presses used to have these metallic plates which could reproduce the same content again and again without any disruptions or without any variations. So the word stereotype originally came from these printing plates. Walter Lippmann, as you must be knowing, wrote this very important book called Public Opinion, which was published exactly 100 years ago in 1922. And he writes in this particular book, Public Opinion, for the most part, we do not first see and then define. We define first and then see. In the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world, we pick out what our culture has already defined for us. And we tend to perceive that which we have picked out in the form of stereotyped for us by the culture. So we have to realize that this is very important, that we define first and then we see. And this is such an important thing to remember. So one of the reasons why we do that is that whenever we recognize or whenever we see a familiar thing, we tend to visualize it with the aid of the images that we already have in mind. So we are kind of not using as much effort as it's required to look at all the sophistications or to look at all the variations that could be there in those personalities, but we look at only the familiar traits, and the rest of it we let the mind form the images for ourselves. And that is such an important thing to remember. So one of the reasons why we are having these stereotypes is that it makes the world appear a lot more easier for us, or it is a world which is a lot familiar to us. So this system of stereotypes tells us that, okay, the world that we know is exactly what it is. So all these people, they are supposed to behave in a different way, they look in a different way, they are supposed to have certain kind of ideologies or not to have certain kind of ideologies. So this is a kind of a defense mechanism also, that when we are talking of these stereotypes, it kind of helps us, or it kind of reconfirms our belief in the world as it always has been. So this is a very important thing to remember when we talk of these stereotypes. It is also a guarantee of our self-respect, because when we talk of how we see the world through the prism of our own values, our own positions, our own rights. So these stereotypes are kind of a reaffirmation of these values, etc. Because whenever we do certain things, we think of those people who do not belong to our group as having those kind of characteristics. That is why these stereotypes are so very well entrenched, that it's not just about media portraying certain stereotypes, but how we see those stereotypes. So time for a quiz now. The word stereotype is derived from A, printing press, B, type machines, C, television, D, telegram. If you answered printing press, that was the correct answer. So welcome back, friends. Stereotype, as we just discussed, is a category-based cognitive response. We regard certain people as having certain characteristics, and we assume that everybody of that type or everybody of that nationality or of that region will have those similar kind of characteristics. So this is the thing that is happening in our heads. This is what happens in our brains. But then what is the result of it? Often the affective counterpart, or the way we feel about those groups, could be prejudiced, and the behavioral counterpart could be discrimination. So we regard those people as having certain characteristics, all right about that, but then it leads to maybe prejudice at times, and it also leads to discrimination at times. So when we judge people not on their individual complexities, but on their inclusion in a certain group. So we judge a person on the basis of whether he belongs to that particular nationality. So we judge a person according to whether he's from China, or whether he's from Nigeria, or whether he's from Malawi, not on the individual characteristics of that particular person, but on whether he belongs to that group or not. And that can be dangerous, as we know. So it can engender things like racism, it can engender things like sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other types of intolerance. And Dominic Lasorsa has spoken in details about all these things, that this concept or this idea of judging people not on their good or bad, but on which group they belong to, can have some very dangerous consequences. And there are certain types of stereotypes that we might already have seen in our daily lives. There is, for example, this he-man stereotype. And there is also an upper class leader stereotype. So these are the basic stereotypes, and all the other stereotypes are partially defined in terms of or in opposition to these stereotypes. So whether a person is a he-man or is less of an he-man, or whether he is opposed to an he-man or something like that, or whether the person has these leadership qualities or does not have these leadership qualities, or something very close to them. So according to Perkins, these are the two basic stereotypes, and everything is related to these kind of stereotypes. Now, an important thing to remember here is that the stereotypes are learned early. So we are exposed to these stereotypes at a very early age, probably during our schooling and those phase of our growing up. They are reinforced often, and they are encountered repeatedly. So we learn them early, they are reinforced again and again, and they are things that are there available to us repeatedly, and that is what makes it automatic. So we do not think about a person, we think about what group he belongs to. And this is because the social interactions are often very superficial. When we interact with people, we are generally not elaborately conversing with them or communicating with them. So just a stereotypical idea about them, or just the generalized idea about them, is what goes ahead. So when motivated to process more elaborately and systematically, or when we deal with those people in a more elaborate form, or when we look at all the other pluses and minuses, then we can look beyond those stereotypes. Otherwise, we are only looking about those generalizations. So the media are very powerful in developing, reinforcing, and validating stereotypical beliefs. So media develops these stereotypes, and as we said in the first part of today's lecture, that this is important because it provides a picture of the world that we are comfortable with, or a picture of the world that we understand. And the media develops these stereotypes and also reinforces it and validates it by showing them again and again in different formats. For example, on a personal note, whenever I have been traveling to foreign airports, people think that all Indians will be very good with IT. So they think that, if they have a problem in their laptop, I'll be able to solve them, because the media has shown Indians again and again as IT experts. So, and there are expectations about those groups. When I meet an Indian, or when a foreigner meets an Indian, for example, they expect that this person will be good with information technology and these kind of things. And this especially works when their experience with real Indians is limited. So these stereotypes are a lot more useful because we do not interact with people with those groups. We have those stereotypes and we think that this is correct. So this is one reason why this happens. And also, media packages information about social groups into simple, identifiable messages. If you remember the video I showed you right at the beginning, so an Italian is supposed to speak like that. So if I have to portray an Italian person, I will go back to those stereotypes and present that personality, so I do not have to emphasize, or I do not have to impress upon people that this is an Italian person. So this helps people to accept and understand people more easily, people whom they have not closely experienced. So to reach a broad audience, the media uses these stereotypical categorizations. So this could be about ethnicity, it could be about gender. So certain gender, we spoke about the He-Man stereotype. It could be about class. So when a person belongs to a certain class, he's supposed to behave like that, or he's supposed to eat or drink or dress up like that. Employment, sexual orientation, religion, mental or physical disability, or even age. So if you've seen a lot of popular cinema, you might have seen how people with mental disability are portrayed as having those kind of similar characteristics. Although we know from experience that there might be very many differences among these peoples in reality. So these stereotypes are automatically activated when audiences encounter these cues or symbols in mass media. So they are automatically activated in my head. And that's why the media uses these cues, because the media does not have to expend a lot of energy in explaining those things. Just a stereotype of, this is how a Chinese would be, or this is how a person from Nigeria would be, or this is how a working class woman would be. And those stereotypes are enough to emphasize that particular personality. They are consistent. These stereotypes are consistent because, as we say, that they are self-perpetuating. We expect to see people in that kind of personality. The media provides people of that particular group in that personality, and that is how it self-perpetuates, because that's what the audience expects, and this is what the media provides. And as we know that these stereotypes are consistent. And if information is inconsistent, if I show a particular group to be very different from what the audiences are used to seeing or consuming on media, then that might lead to some kind of a cognitive dissonance. So that might be an issue as well. And we see these stereotypes very often in television commercials. For example, although things are changing a lot, very often the woman at home, she is the one who is doing the cooking. So they are the ones who are doing the cooking, or they are the ones who are serving breakfast and dinner. So, or even if there are diet products, they target women and so on and so forth. So these kind of gender stereotypes exist in a big way in television commercials. In the American media, for example, and if you've seen a lot of those Hollywood movies, there are a lot of these racial, ethnic stereotypes. So in the early years of American television, and that's from Masto and Greenberg in 2001, the blacks were often characterized as lazy, as untrustworthy and unintelligent, and they were relegated to largely demeaning roles. And this was largely to entertain white audiences, and these black citizens, they were shown living primarily in ghettos and slums. We know this situation has changed now, but this stereotype used to be there for a long, long time. So one of the ways of challenging these stereotypes is by using educational television programs which depict counter stereotypical content. So we show people, blacks who are doing well, or we show people from China who are doing well in other things than we see them normally in the news, in the press, or we see Indians having other characteristics as well. So when we have these educational television programs which show the content in all its variations, in all its sophistication, then the negative stereotypes that children have about those outgroups, this will be decreased substantially. And later on, the adverse reactions or the adverse ideas that we have about these outgroups, that is also changed substantially. Time for a quiz again. So here it is. Stereotyping is generally A, about people known to us, B, about people we meet every day, C, about an outgroup of people, D, about friends. And I'm sure you know it is about an outgroup of people. So we'll now discuss about the reasons for these stereotypings. Not only about why media does it, we've discussed why media does it, but why do we accept these stereotypes? So one of the reasons psychologists say is that because we human beings are cognitive misers. We have this overwhelming complexity of the social environment. So our mental resources are scarce. So we do not use all the mental resources at our disposal. Often we look at shortcuts, or we look at shorter cues to make impressions about people, or to make impressions about situations, or to make meaning of any event or situation that is presented to us. So every day we constantly make judgments, consciously or unconsciously, about various things. And we are using just simple heuristic rules. We are just using whatever we have been thinking about those things, or whatever our experience is, and a very small cue about that person, and we start making judgments about those people. For example, if you're traveling in a train and if you see somebody who's opening up a packet of chips or whatever, and he just throws the packet right beneath the seat. That very moment, without knowing anything about that person, we start making certain judgments about that people. So always we are trying to make meaning based on these certain small things that people do. No, we don't need to talk to them. We don't need to know more about them. Just these small cues enough to make judgment about that particular person. So we often resort to these kind of mental shortcuts. So when there is this system of stereotypes, it is so very well fixed, and we've seen how it is reinforced, how it is repeated, and how media makes use of it to talk about situations without expending a lot of effort into explaining those situations. So our attention is called to those facts which support the image that we have of the world in our head. And if there is something which does not agree with the images that we have in our minds, or the images we have in our mind about people, about situations, we will disregard those kind of information. So we accept information about which we already know, or information which we know are familiar, and we disregard information which is not familiar. And I'm sure you might have heard of this theory of cognitive dissonance. I'm not going to talk about that. But I'm going to talk about two different modes of thinking that we indulge in. And this is the very well-known fast thinking and the slow thinking process. So during time constraints, we go for fast thinking. So whenever there is, as in the example I just gave you, we do not need to go into greater details about that. We just go for information that is available for us. We do not need, or we do not make the effort of getting additional information. So as long as it makes sense, as long as it is consonant or it's similar to things that we already believe in, we do not want to spend more mental resources, we do not want to spend more of our cognitive resources in trying to understand greater about that particular person or that particular situation, or trying to understand additional information about that person or that situation. So we indulge in what is known as fast thinking. At the other end, we also have the slow thinking. And in slow thinking, what happens is that we expend more of our cognitive energy. We expend we elaborate more about that particular person. We think deeper about that particular situation. We try and find out what are the reasons a person is behaving in a particular manner, and what are the reasons that he is in that particular situation. So we are expending a lot more of our mental resources. We think more about that person, more with empathy, and that is important when we are drawing a more nuanced understanding of that person or a situation. So we indulge in fast thinking when we are talking in terms of stereotypical thinking. So we know what stereotypes are, we know why media uses those certain generalizations about people, and most of the time we are also looking for those generalizations because I do not have to expend more energy in understanding that person. But in certain situations we go for what is known as the slow thinking. We actually think more about that person, and we empathize about his or her situation, and we try and understand his position, not because he belongs to a certain group. So people have defined different kinds of stereotypes, and one of them has these two things on the axis. On the vertical axis we have warmth. So the stereotyping could be of low warmth or it could be of high warmth. And on the horizontal axis we have this of competence. People are of low competence or people are of high competence. So if we see on the lower left of the screen, which is low on warmth and which is low on competence. So somebody who is low on warmth and low on competence, that stereotype is known as contemptuous stereotype. So often when we talk of poor people, or when we talk of welfare recipients, or when we talk of those kind of stereotypes, we are talking of people which are low on warmth and low on competence. When we have stereotypes which are low on warmth and high on competence, that is when we have the envious stereotype. So if you see on the right of your screen, we have the envious stereotype. So often, for example, in American societies, they're envious of Asians or people belonging to India and these communities because they are envious. So that is why it is less on warmth and high on competence. Then we have stereotypes which are high on warmth but low on competence. So that is what is the paternalistic stereotype. So when we are talking of housewives, or when we're talking of homemakers, or when we're talking of elderly people, or when we're talking of people with physical disabilities, we are talking of the paternalistic stereotype. So they are high on warmth, we feel warmly for them, but we do not think highly of their competence. So they are paternalistic stereotypes. Then we have what is known as the stereotype which is high on warmth, we feel warmly about them, and which are high on competence as well. And that is the admiration stereotype. That is something that we aspire to. So it could be in-group people or close allies or people whom we aspire to become like. So that is the admiration stereotype. So we can divide stereotypes into these four different types: the contemptuous stereotype, the envious stereotype, the paternalistic stereotype, and the admiration stereotype. Time for the final quiz of the day. Stereotyping generally occurs during A, slow thinking, B, no thinking, C, fast thinking, and D, elaborate thinking. And if you've answered fast thinking, you are right. Thank you very much.